without further ado, we're going to go ahead and begin today's program. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Deborah. Oh, someone's not muted. Deborah Magid. Deborah represents IBM's high growth software hardware business in the company's IBM Ventures program. As a director of strategy in IBM's software business, she brings insight from the venture community to the development of IBM's growth strategies. Deborah is responsible for fueling IBM's ecosystem pipeline in high growth strategic areas such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, security, analytics, blockchain, and cloud computing. She also contributes to filling out the IBM product portfolio through M&A, and she leads the IBM team of venture partners based in innovation ecosystems around the world. More information about Deborah can be found in the link in the chat box. So good afternoon. Let's go ahead and give Deborah a hand or a round of applause and welcome Deborah to this conference.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's delightful.
Perfect. Well, Deborah, I'm so excited to get a chance to talk to you again. I've been reading your bio and reading a little bit about the work that you do. And I think one of the first things that I want to ask right out the gate is what kind of drew you to this kind of work? Because this isn't something that you typically think of as a career field that people just kind of one day wake up and they're like, when I grow up, I want to do all of these things in venture capital. I want to do all these things in research. I want to do these things with startups. So how did you kind of get your start and how did you find this role that you are in now?
It was a funny sort of fortuitous thing. I had a kind of a corporate job at General Electric in Maryland. They had a business unit doing software. And one day in the mid 90s, when I was mad at my boss, I got a call from a recruiter when he still got calls. And because I was mad, I didn't hang up. And this woman offered me a job that was a joint venture between IBM and Apple in Silicon Valley. And I was living in DC. And I knew that those two teams had been working on this project for a long time. And I said, why would I take a job like that? It didn't seem like it was going to be successful. And she said the thing that got me on the plane, which was, it won't matter. You'll be in Silicon Valley and you'll meet everyone, which was absolutely true.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of different jobs in IBM for 2 or 3 years. And then one day, people were trying to pull me back to New York. And I didn't want to go. I liked California. I liked Silicon Valley. And I called up one of the senior leaders of the business who I happen to know and asked him if I really had to move back. And he said, who told you that? No, you don't have to do that. He gave me his home phone number on a Friday night so I could talk to him about it. He said, have a nice weekend. I'll call you on Monday. And on Monday, I had this job.
Oh, wow.
Because it was the exact moment that one of the people in corporate had been bugging this software executive to get a software executive on the venture team to represent these software businesses. And so my career advice to people is you have to create opportunities for luck to happen, because if I hadn't called him, it wouldn't have happened. I was in Silicon Valley and I knew something about this community, but I picked up the phone.
And I think, Deborah, that's a great point. So in a lot of fields, whether it's politics or, in the private sector, a lot of times you have to kind of create your own opportunities. And part of that means networking, building relationships, and getting people to know who you are so that when there is an opportunity that is potentially there, you're able to capitalize on it and making your own luck by actually doing the work ahead of time, because luck doesn't just happen on its own. You have to kind of do some buildup and then all the stars eventually align, but you have to be able to build in that work, really get that foundation set before you're able to actually take advantage of these opportunities when they come up. So I know we talked a little bit about in your bio some of the work that you're doing, but is there anything that I didn't cover that you wanted to highlight about your current work with IBM Ventures?
Sure, because it's probably relevant for this group. You're wondering why I'm here. IBM goes to market in industry sectors, in vertical industry sectors. And one of our highest growth businesses is in biotech and life sciences and healthcare. And so I track that. I work with the teams that are, have these clients, whether it's the payers or the clinics or the hospital systems and the doctors and so forth, and the researchers. And so the people doing clinical trials, doing research, the pharma companies, we have all of these people are our clients. And so, one of the things I look for is how to build out that ecosystem I mean, I do it, financial services as well, and public sector and some other things, but biotech and life sciences is one of our largest businesses.
That's great. Can you tell me, when you're starting to look at startups, how do you even find out about some of the groups that you've worked with over the last couple of years in your current role? How do you identify them? How do you build those relationships? And what advice would you have for folks that are just starting to kind of put themselves out there for the first time?
Yeah, this is important for every single person on this call, which is, it is all about relationships. And so you have to build a network, whether you're just starting out or whether, I still work on it, and I've been doing this for 15 years. So I still work on building my network and building relationships. And I did that as much inside this corporation as I did out in the community. So I find out about interesting opportunities by speaking at events and meeting people, but mostly through the relationships with venture capitalists, because there are too many startups in the world for me to ever know about. I mean, there are thousands and thousands. There are thousands just in fintech. There are thousands just in biotech. So it isn't possible to know about all of them. And you don't want to get connected to them after you read about them in the media. You want to find out about them when it's, early and relevant. So we use the venture capitalists and their portfolios as a filter. They've already done the due diligence. They've already screened a whole lot of companies. They decided to put their money into these few, and it's a good screening mechanism. And they can, if we have a relationship with them, which we do, they'll tell you exactly why they invested in this and not in that, which is really great information for our strategy.
So relationships.
Exactly.
So let's say I'm a brand new startup. I have no relationships. Where would you go, or what would be your first piece of advice on how to start doing that initial networking?
So I did two things for myself when I was new at this, and actually I still do this. If I know, one or two interesting people, I ask them who they like to talk to, and can they make an introduction? And I built my relationship with VCs exactly by doing that. Who do you syndicate deals with? Who else should I know? And then they give you a warm introduction. You're not cold calling people. And the other thing is, get out there, go to these events. It's better if they're in person, because then there's wine.
Right. But, we'll have to get wine the next time I see you, Deborah.
And I was a shy child. I have to make myself do that when I walk into a room full of strangers and, drink wine with them. And it's actually a skill that can be taught. I once was hosted at Harvard for their entrepreneur and VC council and for grad students. They held a wine reception, and they had coached the grad students on how to work the room, how to go to a reception like that and meet people and build their network. If you haven't done it before, it is trainable.
Yeah. I can tell you that in my line of work, in advocacy and in politics, there are so many times where there are opportunities, there are mixers, there are conferences, there are events like this one,
and you just have lunch and learns. There's all kinds.
There's all these things, and there are so many incredible people that I met just by happenstance, because I went to a luncheon 8 or 9 years ago that I'm still close to and that I still rely on for a lot of the work that I do. But it means being a little bit of an extrovert when you're out there. I'm naturally an introvert, and I don't normally enjoy just going and talking to random people. But over the years, it's a skill, like you mentioned, that you can develop to get out there and to introduce yourself, to start building those relationships, because one glass of wine may turn into a partnership that 10 years later ends up resulting in you actually being able to partner and both support your work and their work as well.
I have one other piece of advice along these lines, and I once heard someone who's famous in real estate talk about this. If you put yourself out there as an expert, get an article in the newspaper, get somebody to connect you to a journalist, use social media, get on a panel at a conference like this, or at HIMSS, or any other event, then you're out there, and you're putting yourself in front of people, and they see you as the expert. It's free marketing.
Yeah. It's always great when people are calling you and asking you, what do you think about this?
Right.
Because they've learned over the years that you are the expert, and sometimes you are, and sometimes you kind of fake it till you make it a little bit, but having that reputation for being an expert is so critical, because like you said,
reputation really helps.
it's the reputation. So speaking of reputation, I think when you're meeting with a new firm, what is something that immediately makes them stand out and impresses you when you're meeting with someone who is either pitching you or talking to you about their work?
It's funny. It's how I feel when the meeting is over. I walk out on the sidewalk or, leave, sit back in my dining room here, and I feel excited about it. My husband's a cabinet maker, retired. And if I'm excited about something, I remember enough about it and enough of the key things about it to go tell him about it because I want to tell him about it.
Yeah.
And he'll understand what I'm saying because I really got it when I was being pitched. But there has to be some level of excitement about it, some passion on the part of the entrepreneurs that gets transferred to people like you and me.
Totally. So now kind of on the converse side of that, let's say you met with someone and you decide not to invest or not to pursue a relationship. Why might there be a reason that you would say, I'm not going to go forward with, developing this relationship or investing in them?
Well, we always give a reason and we try to be kind, but sometimes it's because the people just aren't credible or there's too much risk. The risk could be scientific risk, especially when we're talking about biotech and things like this, or semiconductors or things like that, quantum computing. There could be risk that the stuff just won't work. There can also be risk that the team isn't right. There can be risk that it will take too much capital. It could be risk that there's too much competition in the market. It could be risk that it's just not validated properly with potential customers. And then additionally, for a company like ours, maybe it's just not a fit. We're not really doing a lot with e-commerce now. And I was just talking to an investor who mostly invests in that. And, I'm just not going to look at his portfolio because it's not relevant.
Right. As a reminder to folks, if you would like to ask Deborah a question, send it to me in a private message or in the main chat, and we'll be asking questions in a few minutes of Deborah from the audience. But Deborah, one of the things that I know you've done is you've judged pitch competitions, not just here in Arizona or not just in the US, you've judged them all over the world and you've seen differences from different countries. Who does it best and why?
Americans are really good at it because, and other people recognize this, because we're more skilled and less shy about sales and marketing. So we're promoters, right? And in other parts of the world, they're less inclined to put themselves out there and promote what they're doing. They're a little bit more shy about it. And in fact, in some places, I found this out in Southeast Asia, there are people who are afraid to pitch, not because they won't speak in public, but they're afraid to disclose what they're working on. So that's okay if you're in stealth and it's really early, but it's not okay at some point, because if you don't tell people what you're working on, you can't get clients, you can't get partners, you can't hire employees, you can't be part of this network. But I've had people who already had a product who were afraid to pitch because they didn't want to tell people what they were working. They were afraid some competitor would see what they were doing. And I said, well, your job is to beat the competition. That's your job.
Right. So when you're talking about Americans being a little less shy and a little bit more willing to kind of do that promotion and that marketing, are there any things that you've seen as drawbacks where maybe Americans have a reputation for being too willing to kind of self-promote? So on that same token, is there anything that you would kind of flag for our audience?
Yes. Americans do, when they're pitching a VC, they can often oversell something. This is $1 billion business in 2 years. It's the TAM is unbelievable, and I'm going to take this part of the market. We can be overly aggressive about those things, and then you're putting yourself in a position where you're not believable. You want to be aggressive, but in a realistic manner. One of the problems you encounter in Europe and other places is that people are not assertive enough. So I was judging a pitch competition in Ireland, and it wasn't biotech, but it doesn't matter what it was. We asked, I was a judge, and there was a panel, and we asked the founder who was pitching how many units he was going to have in the next year. And he said 10,000. We're like, okay. And how many are you going to have in the second year? And he said 15,000. And we're like, what? Why not 1 million?
Yeah.
And I actually jumped out of my chair and stood up and said, why not 1 million? And his answer was, well, we don't have the means to do that. We're not funded enough to do that. I said, you are pitching in a room full of 300 investors. Tell them what you need. So, what Americans do well is they'll say what they need. They just sometimes oversell, which makes their pitch less believable.
Gotcha. And I know that one of the big things is there's a little bit of a difference between pitching a large corporation like J&J or IBM than something that's different from a VC. Can you tell us, how should a startup that's starting to look at pitching do their pitch a little bit different for a large corporation versus a VC?
So when you're pitching a VC, you obviously have to have some financial projections, and you have to show what the market validation was. Some of the things are the same. You have to have a good team. You have to have validated it with customers, even if you're still in stealth and you haven't shipped yet, and you're still going through clinical trials or whatever, you still have to show that you know who will use this and how you will sell it. Is it going to be licensed? Is it going to be sold outright? Will it need FDA approval? Will it not? So you need some of the same things for a VC versus a corporate. What the corporate needs is, how does this fit with their business? We have a phrase that we use with startups: better together. If we're working together, why is that better than us working individually, right? There has to be a story that you can tell about why it's better together and why you're going together to a potential client. And I've had too many startups pitch me, and then they haven't thought about that. They don't. They're happy to have a meeting with IBM, but they don't know why they're happy. They don't really even know our product line. I had somebody pitch me about some kind of document management thing. I said, well, how does that compare to what we already do? And like, oh, we didn't know you did that. Like, 5 minutes on the web. I'm sorry.
Right. Oh, that just is malpractice.
You have to know who you're talking to.
Right.
If you want a partnership, tell me what you want out of a partnership. If you haven't thought about it at all, postpone the meeting, think about it. You know what I'm saying?
And is that frustrating for you when someone comes in?
It's a waste of everybody's time.
I was going to say, because you're a busy person, you have so many things on your plate, and you're now carving out time to be able to talk to someone who wants to talk to you about how they could potentially work with you, and they come in unprepared.
I haven't thought about it.
How do you handle that? Do you literally tell them like, come back to me?
About it. No, I've cut meetings short.
Okay. Yeah, I can't imagine.
Or if I like the company a lot, because sometimes you look at that and go, we'll cut them some slack. So I cut them some slack and I give them a little bit of coaching, and then I send them away to do some homework. Okay. And it depends how cool the company is.
Okay. So make sure you have a good product, even if you're not selling it
before you go screw it up.
Yeah. So I guess the next question that I have for you is, what is kind of a tip or a secret that you would suggest when trying to build a relationship with a large company? Because I think when someone says, approaching an IBM or a J&J, that just seems like such a behemoth and such a big thing. So what are some of the kind of suggestions that you would have? Obviously, we talked about networking and, having people do, warm intros, but is there anything else that you would recommend for when you're looking at trying to build a relationship with a large company?
Yeah, it's intimidating to think about Novartis or J&J or IBM because we're so big. But actually, all of us are a collection of businesses. J&J is not one business. IBM is not one business. And so what it really helps to get someone to hone in on where they think they fit. And then you can tell the better together story. But it's less intimidating because you're not trying to do a partnership with IBM. You're trying to do a partnership with the consulting business who's working in pharma, or you're trying to do a partnership with the product team that's working in machine learning and AI. Do you see what I'm saying? You're not trying to work with 300,000 people. You're trying to work with this team of 10 people.
Right. So making it smaller bite-sized chunks that makes it a little bit
Yes.
easier to kind of.
The mistake that a lot of people make, and a lot of people make this mistake, is they get all excited about they're going to get these meetings with these different teams and they try to do too much at once. I mean, literally every time I meet with a startup, I ask them how many people they have employed. If they have 3, they can have 1 meeting. If they have 50, they can have a couple different meetings with different groups. But you know, they can't have 40 different meetings, and it is literally possible to do that. So we shouldn't allow anyone to do that. They get overwhelmed. You know, they could go to services, they could go to the consulting group, they could go to the product groups, they can go to research or strategy, or, you know, it's too much. We're a big company, and they shouldn't try to do it all at once.
Wonderful. So I have 2 last questions for you, and then we have a couple of audience questions. So one more plug: if you're an audience member and would like us to ask your question, just send it to me in a private message, and we'll go ahead and start asking those in just a minute. Can you tell me a little bit more about Smarter Planet and how that kind of relates to the biosciences, you know, even including things like agriculture?
Yeah, sure. So the whole idea was to take the notion of analytics and artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, where you have edge devices and sensors. It could be RFID tags. It could even be drones. It could be anything that's not back in a data center, and then have those things work together in an intelligent way to understand something about the planet. It could be the growth of a city. It could be recovery from a natural disaster or from a war. It could be crop science and how crops are being grown and the conservation of resources. So it relates to a lot of things. In ag, it could be how much water are you using, how much fertilizer and nitrogen are you using, and not just like pray and spray, you know, acres and acres and acres, but you can do it row by row and do it in an intelligent manner. You know, there are even autonomous vehicles that can look at the crops that they're driving by or over, like John Deere has that. So, you know, and there's just a lot of tech in that.
And kind of related to that question, what are some of the big trends that you're kind of seeing on the horizon that folks might want to, if they're starting to do their work, be on the lookout for how they might be able to partner for some of the emerging things and trends that are happening in the biosciences?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's, I mean, there's the obvious stuff. Because of a pandemic, there's more telehealth, telemedicine, telemental health, you know, and things like that. And even before the pandemic, personalized medicine was becoming, you know, more to the fore. And because of analytics and data science, you can do more with that than you could. People are looking more at outcome-based procedures. So I've just met a very early stage company that's able to change outcomes based on, you know, what you do about sepsis and understanding it ahead of time and making predictions. So with analytics and machine learning, you can make predictions about patient outcomes and care. So I think the use of analytics and AI and natural language and machine learning, you know, you have these ambient listening devices in doctors' offices that will take the dictation and enter the information into the patient record without the doctor having to sit there and type while you're talking to her. So, you know, I think that this application of technology will be really important for, you know, on many, many dimensions.
Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question that we have from the audience, and it's coming from Ben. So for a firm like Deborah's, how do capital seekers learn ahead what they do and don't invest in? Is there anywhere where this information is published?
Well, we just updated an IBM Ventures website, so I think it's published there. But right now, I'll just tell you, we have not traditionally done, you know, syndicated deals for minority equity investing. We just started doing it last year, but only for companies who are existing business partners. So if there's an alliance and a commercial relationship already in place, then we have the ability to go into a round if that startup is raising a round. We don't do what like Salesforce or Google Ventures does and just invest. We are moving to a model where we can do this in a more open way, but we're not there yet.
So for other firms or other corporations, is there any place that you would recommend so that people are doing their research on where it might be a good place to kind of go?
Yeah, if you're looking for institutional investors, I mean, there's a ton of stuff. Who are the top VCs in biotech? Who are the top VCs in Boston? Blah, blah, blah. If you're looking for a strategic, then we call these people, corporate venture capital. And there's a ton of data about corporate venture capital and which kinds of firms are doing this. It is the case that there are probably over 1,000 corporations in every imaginable sector who have a corporate venture group. J&J has incubators and funds startups, and they spin out tech into startups. So, there's some accelerators. There's one, Health Excel is one that's in Ireland, but has gone more global, and Novartis and IBM and others are on the advisory board. So there are some accelerators that are specifically in biotech, and then there are corporate venture groups that invest or have incubators.
Yeah, so there's an interesting question that I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on. This is coming from Scott, and it says, are there any downsides to pitch or to practice at events if a company is not ready to raise dilutive capital?
Oh, it's what I said before. You want to get out and about and have people know you. So so that when you are ready to raise, if you're ever ready to raise. I know VCs that got to know a company 2 years before they funded them, and they would kind of keep track of what was going on, and the startup can get advice about how they should proceed, and what might be missing from their plan, so they can get coached by the VCs or by people like me, and so there it is. And plus, then if you're looking for partners or looking for employees, then you got yourself out there, and people might meet people who would be suitable.
So you could even use this as a way to kind of build better relationships that when you are ready. Okay, so you wouldn't say that there are any real downsides that you see of basically practice your pitching.
No, and the more you practice it, the better you get at it. The only downside I see, and this is not so much in the US, but you see it in places like South Africa and in Southeast Asia. Some people do it too much. They'll be in 5 different accelerators, one after the other, which means they're not getting to building the business. It's kind of stalled at a certain stage. That's the only thing I would mention.
So practice, but also actually make sure that you're intentionally building out and taking the feedback and actually using it to further the work that you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So Joan has an interesting question, and it is, hi, Deborah. I run Desert Angels, an active angel investment group in Southern Arizona. She mentioned syndication with other investors and groups. What does her group look for when reviewing due diligence from other investors or considering a syndicated deal?
Okay, so I did mention that we're not syndicating deals with companies we don't already know. But we would, if we were syndicating a deal, for example, with a company that we had a partnership with, we would look for the same things that you guys do. We would do the due diligence. We would look for, the tech, the team, the market, the customers, and so forth. The growth year on year in the company projections, financial projections.
Gotcha. Dean's question for you is there a return premium for hard tech investments, device and software versus software only? And how does the pitch to investors change between the two?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a really good one, because there are some investors who will invest in hard tech that include both components, and there are others who won't. And the reasons for that tend to be hard tech is more capital intensive often, and it's harder to predict or project how the company will really grow to be big. Because you're relying on more things. You're relying on materials and manufacturing and distribution that works very differently if it's pure software. The margins in software are bigger typically. And so, I'm working with a couple companies right now that have both hardware and software, and they're great companies, and we do have partnerships with them. It also affects their exits. Like, we won't buy a company that's both hardware and software. We'll only buy a software company. So it affects which investors you could actually pitch, and it will affect exits.
Gotcha. And then Chris here had a question. We're going to do a couple of rapid fire because we have a A lot of great questions, which please keep them coming. Deborah, can you give us an example of great startups that IBM has invested in both here in the US and overseas? And what exemplified how well and how this exemplifies how well your program is working at IBM?
Well, we've invested in a couple of quantum computing companies recently, one in the US and one in the UK. And what we're trying to do in quantum is build out a network of people who use these systems, because we make ours available to developers. And so we want an ecosystem around what we're doing so we get a broader reach. And so the reason this is successful is because we get more reach and so does the startup. And it's a very nascent market. So you want to be working with people who are doing the research and who are really deeply technical and deeply into it. So that's one example. Another example is a company we met a long time ago that was building an appliance to help websites be more secure and faster. And this was, in the early 2000s when that was important and the tech wasn't quite there yet. And we got to know these guys. It was 3 crazy Russians who, had something in stealth, but it was kind of working. So we tested it in our lab and it was really great. So we didn't make an investment, but what we did is we started working together on the tech and validating it with clients and testing it further. And then we started blogging together and being on stage at conferences together. And 3 years later, we bought the company. So that was an exit for them. So the investment in that case was the acquisition. In the case of the quantum companies, it was actually a minority equity investing to make us all more successful in a new market.
Great. We have a question from Daniela. Should a team or company have federal funding before approaching a venture capital firm? And then after you answer that question, there's a second and a third part.
Okay, it is absolutely not necessary. I know some companies that have funding from the Air Force or from various agencies or from the DOE, but the VC will just look at why they're doing that and what you're doing with the feds in the same manner that they would look at what you were doing with an accelerator or with a corporate, the feds are a client, right? And so, even if it's an agency, it's still like a client relationship. Right. And so it's fine, but it's not necessary.
And then related to that, the next part of that question is, do VCs fund early stage projects? And is there an ideal stage when we should approach a VC?
So VCs have, each firm has its own manner of investing. Some will invest at the seed stage. They'll do a few $100,000 as an investment. Some will only do later stage deals, so you wouldn't approach them at all if it was an early stage company. Some will do A rounds, which are more like single digit millions. Well, an A round these days could be bigger than that, but let's say it's single digit millions. And so it depends on where the company is. So a VC that's investing at the seed stage or in an A round wants to see it. You don't have to actually have something in the market, but you do have to have the validation that the market is there, and you have to have talked to clients. You have to know how you're going to sell it, who you're going to sell it to, how they're going to use it. And I don't mean just like I'm going to sell it to Sutter. I mean, you're going to sell it to this kind of person at that corporation. I'm going to sell it to the CFO or to the COO, right, or to the docs. So, you need to have some clarity. And the mistake that people make, especially at early stages, is they don't project what they need the money for and how much money they're going to need to get to the next milestones. And I've seen companies fold because they waited too long to capital raise and they ran out of money. This is so sad. I've had people come to me and say, do you know any angel investors and can you introduce me? And I'm like, yeah, sure. I do know some. What do you need and when? I'll be out of money in 2 weeks.
Oh, no.
Sorry. I've literally had that happen. Don't ever do that. Don't. It's better to raise more than less, because right, if you're the founder or the CEO, it's consuming to go fundraise. It's just, right, it's a full-time job while you're running the company too. Right. So if you have to do it too often, you're not spending enough time running the company. So make sure you know how long the money will last, how much you need. If you really need 10 million, but you just want to ask for 2 because you think it'll be easier, don't do that.
Right. And I guess kind of one of the lessons that I've learned over the years in my line of work is you don't ask for a lifeboat when you need it. You ask so that it's ready to go for when the time comes.
Very good advice. Very good. I like that. I'm going to steal that.
If you wait until 2 weeks before you're out of funding, there's no guarantee
Just
that
shut down the
anyone will be able
business.
to
Just
move.
shut it down.
Well, there's no way that they're going to be able to necessarily move it that quickly.
You can't even get a bank loan that fast.
Exactly.
You can get a bridge loan, and Silicon Valley Bank, does debt financing, and so do others. Bridge Bank does debt financing, but they're not going to do it in 2 weeks either. You still need
exactly.
You still need to do the paperwork and the due diligence. So
right.
But that, by the way, that is another source of funding, though. Debt financing is a source of funding.
That is a good flag, debt financing, if you haven't looked into it. So we have 2 more questions for you, Deborah. Sometimes when bootstrapping, securing the desired investment takes a backseat to securing functional capital. What's the best way to circumnavigate short-term operational capital? And that's coming from Travis.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't really make a big distinction between the two. I mentioned debt financing, which can help bridge, between equity capital. But usually, if you take money from a bank or from a VC or from an angel or from a grant, what are you going to use the money for? You're going to use it to pay your engineers, to pay your doctors, if they're doctors on staff, to pay your researchers, to pay, the building, the computers. It's what the money for sales and marketing. It's what the money is used for. It's used for running the business in all its aspects. So I don't make a distinction between the money that's used for operational stuff and the money that's used for staff or for planning or for getting to the next milestone. It's all part of running your business.
Gotcha. And then Travis just added, the old idea of friends and family sometimes doesn't work for founders. So is there any advice that you would have on that kind of front?
Yeah, friends and family makes me nervous. I mean, a lot of people do that. And what's more likely to be successful is if you have colleagues who you've known for a long time and the 2 of you want to work together and build the company together and you're each going to put some money into it. But don't go to your parents. It's your sister. It's just too risky. This is called risk capital. At least this session's called risk capital, right? It is risky. It is risky. One of the things that Americans do well is they know how to fail and learn from the failure and try it again. But if you fail, you do lose the money. So you're not going to pay it back. So people do use it. And in fact, families sometimes build the company together, husband and wife teams or brothers, and that's risky too. That makes the VCs nervous because there's a different dynamic.
And what would be some of your best advice to an early stage of what things you can do wrong early on and things that you can see as a deal breaker when they hit your level of capital raise?
Yeah,
that's coming from Ben.
It's really the same. Well, I mentioned market validation and making sure you know who your customers are and that they will actually pay money for what you're doing. So that's a given. A common mistake is to not really understand the landscape. There might not be any direct competitors, but customers always have some alternative. They could just not do this, or they could do something else, or they could do part of it. And so the biggest mistake that I see is just, companies coming in and they either don't know who their competitors are, or they don't have a good sense of what their own intellectual property is and how they're going to really differentiate. Maybe it's through IP, maybe it's through their connections in the market. Maybe they know a lot of people and that's part of their, intellectual capital, but it's a real mistake not to understand the landscape and how you fit into it and how you're going to get ahead.
Yeah, and then there was a little birdie that told me that you have an interesting or funny story about a time that you reached out to an entrepreneur and you called them and they did not answer your phone call. Juliet said that he had an interesting story that we could close that on. Can you tell us a little bit about that time?
Yeah, well, it was actually a little different than that. There was a company we wanted to buy, and it was an early stage company. They had probably $80,000, 80,000, not million, $80,000 of revenue, but the tech was good and we liked the team. And there was one other company in the market and they sold for a few million, the competitor. And so one of our senior executives called me one day and said, you have to do something about this. This guy wants 500 million for us to buy the company.
Yeah.
An early stage company with $80,000 of revenue. I said, why did he say that? And the executive said, I don't know, you better call somebody on their board. So I called the VC and I got him on his cell phone. And when I told him the story, he just burst out laughing. He said, well, that guy isn't very experienced. I'll go talk to him. So he talked to the founder and got him down to 100 million. And of course, we still didn't buy the company at that price. And they went out of business. Then nobody ever acquired them. So what I'll say to this group is there are tricks of the trade in how you value your business, how you price it, how you decide who to raise money from and how to do it, how to understand what your market is. You need, those things are all can be taught. In fact, there's classes about how to do those things if you don't already know how to do them. CB Insights has a really nice report on how, valuation. So you can learn about these things if you don't already know about them, but if you're going to run an early stage company, you have to know about them. And if you're going to run a later stage company and you think you're going to win an exit, you do still have to know about those things.
Yeah. And I guess there are a couple other things that came up that I'm curious that we'd love to kind of get your insight on is for someone who's a biopreneur who's trying to find the right company or the right VC to fund their company or their product, how would you go about doing that initial research? Because you've mentioned like there's going online and typing but other than going online and Googling something, what would be some of the other advice that you would give to someone who's just getting started and trying to figure out who might be the right kind of VC or company to go and try and
you need to go to events that have both VCs and startups in them, because you can see how the other startups are operating and what they're doing, and you can meet the investors. And there are a lot of conferences like that. They're sort of generic ones that'll have a biotech track, and then there are just bio-focused ones that you can attend. I wasn't kidding about Googling stuff though. I mean, Google biotech venture capitalists in Boston. There's several really good ones. There's Atlas, there's BMP, there's HLM, and BMP only invests in healthcare. They don't invest in pharma, or medical devices, but HLM does. And it is actually that Googling top 10 biotech investors. That is not a worthless exercise. I do it myself all the time.
Have you ever found anything that surprised you when you've done that kind of Google search?
Yes, I've been surprised about where some of these people are. I've found interesting firms in Chicago and Denver and other places that I don't normally visit. And I just started building out my network more in Denver and Boulder and Colorado Springs, because there's a cluster of startups and a few investors in Colorado now. And, I didn't know a lot of people in Arizona until now. So, I'm always surprised about where things are happening. I will tell you that there are startups in every single country in the world, everywhere. I've met startups from the Sudan. I've met startups from Nepal. It is not the case that there's capital everywhere. And so it's important for people fundraising and thinking about growing their businesses to understand what kind of capital is available and where it is.
So we're kind of in a weird environment right now still, where people aren't necessarily meeting in person always. So what advice would you give to someone who is trying to do that initial outreach or trying to build those relationships? Because before it would be you get on a plane and go to Colorado Springs. But what would you kind of give as advice, kind of as we're closing out here, for folks as we have shifted to a more virtual and a Zoom environment, for folks who are looking at either building a relationship or pitching? And are there any potential red flags or any warnings that you'd give as people are doing stuff virtually versus in person?
It is harder. Every time I talk to an investor now, and then the last year, I ask them if they're funding teams they've never met before. Some of them were only funding teams they had met previously, or maybe they started the due diligence before the pandemic hit, and so they had met once or twice already, and so they weren't going in cold. Others have done recently purely Zoom deals. And since you can't go to these events, although they're starting to, I'm going to one next week, they're starting to have smaller ones. Since you can't really do that much, that whole notion of networking and relationship is going to be key, because the VCs will want a warm introduction. You can't just call them, they won't answer. In fact, it works the other way around. There was a really hot startup in the data science that I wanted to meet. That actually our business leaders wanted to meet them and cold called them, and this vice president at IBM never got a response. So I got a warm introduction from one of their investors who I know. So it works both ways. You need that network, otherwise, because you just can't cold call these people, they won't respond.
Right, because I'm sure they're getting tons of people doing the exact same
thing. I
mean,
one VC might get 1,000 pitches sent into them, or inquiries, and they'll fund 5. So yeah, it's a hell of a filter.